Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about progressive overload and programming for it as really being your most important training variable. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright guys, when it comes to gains, and by gains I'm going to talk about hypertrophy. We're not going to necessarily talk about performance and joint angle specificity and all that good stuff, but what we do need to talk about is what a lot of people out there are training for, and that's gains. That's getting bigger, gaining muscle, which does matter to all the other stuff. A bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, so you better be hoping to stimulate a fair amount of hypertrophy if you want to get more powerful, more explosive, stronger, lift more weight, all that stuff. So again, even for people in a sport-specific context, there's still a good reason to focus on this to some extent. So we get over to this topic, and we will argue about a lot of things. We'll argue ad nauseum about rep ranges. We'll argue about training frequency, exercise selection. That's something that at least one subscriber, a regular daily poster, had pointed out to me the other day. Like, a lot of the top experts out there in the field don't really harp on exercise selection that much versus the programming. Like, why do you talk so much about exercise selection? And it's mainly because I think people do choose inefficient exercises towards their goals, and because I do promote training minimalism to some extent. By minimalism meaning you don't need that many different exercises. In that context, I think exercise selection can be important. But truth be told, let's say you're trying to pick a good upper middle back, so again, trying to get your lats, your rear delts, your traps, your biceps, forearms, all that stuff. Realistically speaking, if a person were to train with really good programming, with a pretty good amount of volume, a lot of progressive overload, do you think they would see a significant difference if they did the pull-up, chin-up, barbell row off the floor with a barbell, a T-bar row, right? You take those 4 exercises. Realistically speaking, as long as you use pretty effective variations with solid range of motion, full range of motion on those 4 exercises, do we really think if the programming and progressive overload is on point that you're going to see a significant difference in hypertrophy between those 4? In other words, if you had one person do any one of those 4, do you think if they use that as their primary exercise for that we would see a dramatically different look to their physique as a result of it? Probably not. Probably not. Now, do some of those work different muscles at different ratios? Do the rows off the floor, both the Pendlay row and the T-bar row, do they work more the posterior chain a little more? Do they get the hips involved more? Do they get more core involvement? Absolutely. Is there the potential for a little more arm? Things like that from the pull-ups? Or the chin-ups? Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a little more potential there. But all things considered, I don't think we would see an enormous difference. The same thing, we could argue about leg development, purely leg development. A back squat versus a front squat. If someone were to train one of them really, really hard for a year with a great volume, great progressive overload, do you really think you would see a dramatic difference in their legs if they chose one or the other, as long as workload, volume, intensity, that's your progressive overload right there, we're on point? Probably not. Probably not. Then we get over to this point about frequency. Well, frequency I think does matter. It does matter. I believe higher frequency training works better. But we do get into some arguments as to, for more advanced lifters, there is a bit of conflicting data as to whether training a muscle more than twice a week with sufficient volume and workload, if you see improved hypertrophy. Well, there's some studies that do show it with really high frequencies, small amounts more, but they are in the minority. The majority of studies don't necessarily show significantly more. In some cases, if it's there, it's a statistically insignificant amount. But it really varies on the study. But I'll be honest, the majority of studies out there do show negligible, or at least statistically insignificant difference by adding a 3rd or a 4th training session per week for a given muscle group, if the first 2 have sufficient volume and workload and intensity. So, we get into a real big point of contention there. But what we do know is that progressive overload is king. And what I mean there is that, okay, you could run a program to where, let's say, you train the squat or the bench press, because it doesn't matter. I mean, powerlifters, bodybuilders, physique competitors, most people do these lifts who are serious about their gains. Those are lifts that most people are going to do. Training them twice a week versus 3 times a week. In theory, the 3 times a week is going to have more potential for muscle protein synthesis, uptime through the week. But if you have better progressive overload on the 2 days a week, the twice a week is still going to add more muscle than the 3 days a week. If you've got a stronger progression pattern, you got more progressive overload. So that's kind of an interesting dilemma there. We could even go back and argue, and I hate to say it, I don't like bro splits, and I think anyone who does bro splits without a lot of drugs, your legs is going to be one of the things that's going to lag the most. Because realistically, let's say you have a 5-day bro split. Your legs are only going to get hit once unless your back day involves the deadlift, right? Back day involves that because a lot of guys will be able to have leg day, chest day, arm day, shoulder day, back day. Well, you start looking at the upper body, that's 4 different upper body days. What if you're doing pull-ups? Weighted pull-ups is on your back day. Well, that's going to work chest and triceps and delts. All right, it will work some chest. Now it's going to work the chest and triceps as hard as it can hit on the other days. But you start looking at a lot of your big compounds that people are doing, and you especially start looking at, again, you add in a shoulder day and arm day. Well, what's on that arm day? Is it just isolation? The arms are going to get worked all 4 days. Arms are getting 4 training days a week. So it would make sense if you're training your arm 4 days a week on that rotation. It does make sense why that type of training does lead to decent arms, because it's like if on your chest day you're doing some sort of benching and dips and stuff, you got 2 different big compound movements, or flat bench, incline bench, whatever. If you got some sort of big movement there, yeah, obviously you're going to get your triceps are going to get worked. Shoulder day, biceps and triceps both tend to get worked. Back day, biceps tend to get worked with sometimes some tricep overlap, and then they have their own day. So yeah, arms do tend to grow, but it's because you're giving them so much work. It's not because you have a special arm day. It's because 4 out of your 5 days are arm day, technically. So again, you get all that overlap. Same with shoulders. Shoulder delts get worked all 4 days. Bench press works delts. Pull-ups work delts. Rows work delts. Then they got their own day on top of it. And depending on what you do on the arm day, they're getting more work. So yeah, shoulders, delts, and biceps and triceps tend to get worked with more volume than anything else in the body. And then you have that leg day, where because the legs don't really get worked on the other days, unless, of course, you do a lot of deadlifting or something on the back day, a lot of standing work. Or your shoulder day has some push press thrown in, which most people don't. So, we can argue about the frequency there, but the point would be, in theory, if you had 2 people at the same point and you were comparing them and you did have a 3-day-a-week program for every body part, but they aren't progressing on it and they're not adding weight to the bar, they're not progressing on volume, workload, intensity being weight on the bar, but on the body part split, on the big lifts at least, they are getting progression, or more progression than you're getting on the other, which people would say, well, that doesn't always happen. No, it doesn't always happen, because it does have less potential for total muscle protein synthesis uptime. But in theory, that lower frequency, if more progressive overload is there, will give more growth, because without progressive overload, none of this other stuff matters, does it? In other words, you're only going to get so much growth from doing the same volume and workload and intensity on any given exercise, no matter how much you train it or how frequently you train it or how good of an exercise it is. Without progressive overload being present, you do not have any mechanism in place to stimulate hypertrophy. The pump and the volume and all that stuff has a limited application outside of progressive overload. If that's all you have going, your growth is going to eventually come to a screeching halt with no progression, right? It will come to a halt without any progressive overload there. And so at the end of the day, we do need to remember progressive overload is king. It matters more than the rep ranges you do, your training frequency, and in many cases, even more than which specific exercises you pick when it comes to your gains. And that's just the reality of it. Alright guys, well that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.